Good evening, everybody. Um, I'm Mike Aiken, chair of the Roman Roads Research Association. For those who don't already know, I can see a lot of regular names in the audience tonight, but quite a few new ones, which is always good. I'm going to start very slowly because we've still got people coming in, I see. Um, so I don't want everybody to miss this. As I'm sure you're all aware, this talk will be recorded, and if I can ask everybody to make absolutely sure that they remain muted and their videos turned off. Um, I do want to apologise actually for not having been able to get some previous talks up online yet. That's entirely my fault. We do have a couple of volunteers waiting to be shown how to do it, but I've just not had the chance. So we will be dealing with that over the next week or so and hopefully be able to catch up. So apologies again for them. Just for that, just blame me. Everybody else does. Right. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker tonight, who is Alan Montgomery. And I actually spent some time, Alan, trying to find out a bit about you, but there's not that much available online.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you a bit about me, so I saved you the job, I guess.
Okay. I do know that you grew up in Edinburgh, but currently living in London, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's where I am now.
Um, yes, I found a bit on one of your authors' pages somewhere, so it does tell us a little bit. He originally studied history of art at Glasgow and worked for many years in the art world before returning to heritage history and a bit of archaeology. And I know what that feels like, although I never worked in the art world, strictly speaking, because I was actually a painter. So,
Oh.
yeah, there you go. Um, I am fascinated by your PhD. I must read this. Alan actually was analyzing 18th century attitudes towards the ancient Roman world. That's, yeah, well, I suspect that's a very interesting read. Anyway, I'm not going to prattle on any longer, Alan. I'm going to hand over to you. You're already sharing your screen. So, right, I'm going to disappear and we'll see you again. For anybody who's new, if you want to put any questions to Alan, just use the chat function. They'll be relayed to me at the end of the talk and I will put them to Alan then. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Thank you very much, of course, to the Roman Road Research Association for hosting me tonight to talk about my brand new book. It's literally just been out a few days, in fact. This book is a record of my journey along a Roman road, starting very close to the England-Scotland border and heading up into Aberdeenshire and right up almost to the Murray Firth, in fact, following in the footsteps quite literally of the first Roman invasion of the land that we know of as Scotland, the invasion that was led by the famous General Agricola. Now, we know a fair amount about this invasion, as I'm sure many of you know, thanks to the incredible survival of the fascinating and often quite frustrating text by the Roman author Tacitus, dedicated to Agricola and his exploits, including everything that he gets up to in northern Britain. So I split the lecture into three parts. I'm going to do a quick bit about me and my research, which Mike has very briefly done, kind of leading up to the genesis of this book and why I wrote this book. Then I'm going to dig into the history that we're talking about, both the ancient Roman history, but also something that I guess you could say, equally interested in, which is the rediscovery of Tacitus's text and then the rediscovery of the material remains that relate to this invasion, including the road itself. And the third part, I will show you some of the highlights of my journey. Just the editor highlights, of course. I believe some of the viewers tonight are in the midst of reading the book, so hopefully there won't be any too many massive spoilers. But I'll share with you some of the more interesting things that I found along the way.
Alan, you've muted yourself.
Sorry, my share doesn't seem to be working. I can't move it. I might
It,
log out and come back in again if that's
it,
all right.
it is working. You just need to go to screen onto
I'm clicking on
presentation view.
I'm clicking on lots of things and nothing's happening though.
Alan, make sure you haven't got PowerPoint open twice.
Yeah, I think I might
Maybe
do.
close PowerPoint down and start again.
It's not letting me close anything. This is a good start, isn't it? Here we go. I'm going to shut it all down and try that again. Thank you for that advice. Let's try that again. The joys of Zoom. I haven't done this for a long time and now I'm remembering why. Right. Shut that down. Share screen. On current slides. There we go. We're off at last. So
Yeah.
yes, we're here. Let's talk quickly about my background. As Mike was saying, I grew up in Edinburgh, and I've always been fascinated with history and heritage. As a young kid, when most kids my age were reading comics and playing football, I was begging my parents to take me to ruined castles and standing stones and abbeys, and of course Roman forts. This photo shows me in 1982 on my first visit to Hadrian's Wall, which is a very formative trip for me. And I think it was just after this that I started to discover that Scotland had its own Roman remains, very close to, in fact, to where I was growing up. As Mike said, I ended up going to Glasgow Uni, studied history of art, moved to London, worked in the art world. But then I went back to studies as a mature student. I did a master's in classical civilization at Birkbeck. And it was during that that I discovered the whole concept of classical reception. So the idea of looking at how the classical world was interpreted in more recent times. And I ended up writing my master's dissertation on the post-Roman history of the Antonine Wall, the Roman frontier in Scotland. So looking at how it inspired all sorts of fascinating myths and legends and how it was preserved and destroyed and all the different ways it's been viewed over the centuries since the Romans abandoned it. That led me to a PhD. And in fact, I was looking at 18th century perceptions of Roman Scotland in particular. 18th century being a time when there was huge interest in ancient Rome, an emerging interest in ancient history, and the beginnings of archaeology, antiquarianism, as we call it, the very beginnings of archaeology, the study of material remains. And in 2022, my PhD was published as the book Classical Caledonia. And I really enjoyed writing that. It was a real pleasure. And I decided I wanted to write some more, but this time I wanted to write something that was more accessible to the general reader. Classical Caledonia is very much an academic text, but I decided to write a book about the Antonine Wall and its long and complex story. I was inspired by a book which some of you may be aware of, called A Walk Along the Wall, which was written by Hunter Davis back in 1974 about his walk along Hadrian's Wall. And I think that really changed public perceptions of that monument back in the 70s, and it stayed in print for many decades, in fact. And I thought that Antonine Wall deserved something similar, something that could be read by non-specialists, non-academics that would kind of bring it to life and shine a spotlight on it, because it's certainly compared to Hadrian's Wall, it's very much overlooked, wrongly overlooked in my opinion. So I walked along it. It's 38 miles long. I did it in 3 different journeys. It took much longer than expected, partly because of COVID, mostly because of absolutely appalling weather. But it was, in general, fascinating and really enlightening experience. So after that, of course, I wanted to write some more. My publisher said I could. So this is what led me to the road to Mons Graupius. When I was researching my PhD, looking at these 18th century interpretations of Roman Scotland, I became very aware that 300-ish years ago, there was a huge fascination with Agricola and his invasion of North Britain. I knew there was lots of physical evidence of that invasion that had been left behind. I'd seen some of it when I was a child, and I'd read about a lot of it. I knew, of course, that there was a big mystery about the battle that concluded that invasion, the Battle of Mons Graupius. And I also knew that there was a road that linked up many of the major sites and led me from south of Scotland right up into the north. So I decided that would be the route for a journey, and a journey during which I could explore all these different aspects of it. So this time I set off not walking. I did walk some of it, as I'll explain in a minute, but it's a long, long way, this one. I think it's about 150 miles as the crows flies, and much, much further along the road, or as close as you can get. So there was a bit of cycling and quite a lot of driving along, as I have christened it, the road to Mons Graupius. So let's look at the map. I'll get my laser pointer working here. Yeah, it's being a bit more agreeable now. So I started down here. The English-Scotland border is just north of Chew Green. You can see the red line, which is the road. I was able to walk from around here right up to Newstead, which again, as the crow flies, is about 20 miles, but more than that along the road. Next bit, there was some driving and then a bit more walking at Sutra, up past here, and then driving up to the site of the Roman fort at Elgin Hall. Now, on this map, it shows the road carrying on from here right up to, well, that's where the Antonine Wall would later be built, in fact. But the reality is there are, as far as I know, no traces of the wall here. And some people leave it off the map and maybe even suggest that there isn't a bit of road there. But for my narrative purposes, we assume that there was. So I picked up the route again just at the Antonine Wall, drove up to Ardogh and just beyond. And then I cycled along this bit, which is called the Gask Ridge. That's a line of high ground that reaches along to Perth. I did notice we've got some viewers from that part of the world in tonight. It's a very beautiful and a great cycle. Lots of road and other things to see there. And then I was back in the car and heading, first of all, west and then north and away off the top of this map, visiting several of the potential sites of Mons Graupius. So I took photographs as I went along the way, of course. I met lots of really interesting people, archaeologists, historians, local residents, landowners, people who own some of these amazing Roman monuments. I met Dr. Andrew Tibbs, who I know has spoken to the association before. And I came home and wrote it all up. What I also did this time was do my own illustrations. So this is my little watercolored painting and ink drawing of one of the signposts. The southern bit of that route, the bit I walked, is an official public footpath. It's well signposted. And as you can see from this sign, this was just near Jedburgh, in fact, this part of the Roman road is often referred to as Deer Street. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. This name is a post-Roman name. It relates to the fact that further south, the same road ran through a post-Roman kingdom called Deira that was somewhere between the rivers of the Humber and Tees. Because I should say, although I started my route on the England-Scotland border, or just about, the road that I followed does head much, much further south all the way to York. But it was Scottish history that I was particularly interested in. So that's why I chose to start at Woden Law. So before I share with you some of the things that I encountered along the road, I thought it might be useful to run through the history, because of course this book is all about history. I suspect some of this may be familiar to some of you, but maybe not to others. This book is also the story of how this information came down to us, of course, through both the archaeology and the text by Tacitus. And I also look at how previous generations have looked at these things. And it's a mix of all these different elements. So we're talking about what is almost certainly the first Roman invasion of Scotland. But of course, I'm putting Scotland in inverted commas here because this is 8 centuries pretty much before something that we would recognise as Scotland appears. So North Britain would be, of course, a more accurate way to describe it. So this invasion is ordered by the Emperor Domitian. You can see him here, a bit of a rogue by all accounts. It takes place, the Scottish part of it takes place in the late 70s and early 80s AD. All the dates I'm going to be mentioning are AD, so I'll probably stop saying AD at some point. And this conquest could certainly be classified as a success. They do conquer I would argue, all of the north of Britain, but it doesn't last. Occupation doesn't last, and all the evidence points to an organized retreat around about 86 or 87. The most common reason given for that is that there was trouble elsewhere in the empire. They needed to withdraw the troops and send them off to the other end of the empire. But we don't know that for sure. That is just a theory. The first Roman invasion of the north, because of course they do come back in the 140s. Antoninus Pius occupies the south and builds his wall across the narrowest part of the British mainland. And then in the early 3rd century, Septimius Severus heads up there and commits what we would describe as genocide before retreating south and promptly dying in York. So this incredible first invasion of the north is led by Gnaeus Julius Agricola. We don't have any contemporary portraits of him. This image you can see here is a very fanciful painting of him by an artist called William Brassey Hall. This is a frieze in the wonderfully Gothic National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, which features famous figures from Scottish history. It's everything from the Stone Age right up to worthy Victorians, in fact. So Agricola was born in south of France, as we would call it, in the town that is now Fréjus. And he came to Britain 3 times in all, in fact. He had a very impressive military and political career. First came to Britain as a military tribune in AD 58, and probably, we think, played a role in helping to suppress the Boudiccan revolt. He returned a few years later to take up command of the 20th Legion. And then it's finally in AD 77 that he returns to take up the role of the governor of the Roman province of Britannia. Now, those of you who have looked into the written history of Roman Britain will know that the ancient sources are at best patchy. But this period is, you could say, the exception. We do know relatively a lot about Agricola, and that is all thanks to the other chap that you can see in this image, his son-in-law, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, arguably ancient Rome's greatest historian, and, as I say, not coincidentally, married to Agricola's daughter. And as any good son-in-law would do, Tacitus decides to write a very complimentary, laudatory biography of his father-in-law. And by several amazing strokes of good luck that I go into in the book, that text has survived from the ancient world. Of course, it's one of a tiny proportion of ancient sources that have survived up to today. It includes lots of information about Agricola, the man, his career, his life. But really the most dramatic events that it features focus on this invasion of the north. And the denouement, if you like, is the description of this great battle, which takes place next to a hill called Mons Graupius, the Graupian Hill. And I would describe that as one of the great set pieces of ancient literature. It's also a very complex text, very confusing, very problematic, because it's very unclear to us which parts are history and which parts are fiction. There are some bits that are obviously fiction, but there are other parts that we can never be quite sure. Now, I always think it's important to remember that when the Romans arrived in North Britain, they were not arriving in an empty landscape. Certainly when you read older histories of these events, you tend to not really hear about the people who were already living there. There were lots of different peoples living there, as you can see in this map. This is supposedly taken from sources referring to the middle of the 2nd century, but we can assume it was a similar 8 decades before. You can see up at the top here, we have the people called the Caledonii. Tacitus does mention a place called Caledonia. Where that is exactly, we're not clear. He calls the people who live in this northern part of the island, he actually calls them just Britons. We would often refer to them as Caledonians, in fact, but Tacitus just uses the term Britain. Now, one thing that is particularly frustrating about Tacitus, particularly for people like me, is that he's not particularly hot on geography. So he mentions place names, but doesn't really tell us where they are. He obviously doesn't, well, I think he doesn't really understand British geography, and why should he? I suppose Tacitus almost certainly never came to Britain. But using the clues in the text, and also, of course, the archaeological remains, which I'm going to show you some of in a minute, historians have put together this conjectural map. The numbers there are the dates, the year. Every summer there's a new campaign. Normally they're heading further and further north whenever they can. This thing of matching the written word with the remains on the ground is something, as we'll see, that people have been trying to do for centuries. It is often very difficult to get them to match. We assume that the Roman army are building this road that I followed as they go, or possibly just after the conquest. We can't be that specific. And in fact, as I'm sure a lot of you know, dating ancient roads is very challenging in general. So you certainly can't be too specific as to what stage it was constructed as part of this campaign. But the point was to provide access for the army as it marched north and really consolidate Roman power across North Britain. Now, the one big mystery that still remains unsolved is where this famous Battle of Mons Graupius occurred. Tacitus gives us some very vague clues. He says, of course, it took place next to a hill. That's the hill that he calls Mons Graupius. He mentions that the hill was occupied by the indigenous tribes, which could imply, I suppose, a hill fort, maybe, possibly. He says that the Romans built a camp facing the hill, and that in between the hill and the Roman camp is a plain. And that is pretty much it. He includes a vivid description of the battle. He includes the famous speeches, first by Calgacus, a supposed chieftain of the confederacy of the northern tribes, rousing his troops, and then Agricola does something similar. Then the fighting takes place, and it's a concise victory for the Romans. So yes, people have been hunting for Mons Graupius for many years. This map shows just a few of the possibilities. This is in a book called The Battle Lost by Gordon Maxwell that was published in 1990, and I think there's at least a couple more theories have popped up since then. Now, I do want to make absolutely clear at this stage, I never intended to add to the long list of potential battle sites. So I'm not going to claim for a minute that I found a new Roman camp next to a big hill and a field in between with lots of rusty swords sticking out of it. It would have been nice, but I didn't expect it, and it definitely didn't happen. What I did was select a few of the sites that I thought were possibly the most compelling, or just ones that had an interesting story to tell. I visited at least one that was the favorite of one of the 18th century antiquarians who has a completely potty reasoning for it, but that was interesting in that respect, even though I knew it was almost certainly not Mons Graupius. So let's also quickly talk about this famous text written by Tacitus, published at the end of the first century. It's his first published work, in fact. Obviously becomes fairly well known in the Roman world, but then Tacitus seems to fade in popularity by the end of the Roman world, and then we really lose track of it. Obviously, it's copied at some point in a medieval abbey, because in the 1420s in an abbey in Germany, some Italian humanist scholars discover a single manuscript copy of this text, which is often referred to back then as On the Life of Julius Agricola. It seems to stay in Germany for a long time for reasons we don't understand, but it eventually makes it to Italy in the 1450s. And at that point, it almost immediately disappears again. But the good news is it had been transcribed, printed versions were produced, and although we don't know when, it was presumably in the decades after that that copies of the Agricola finally made it back to Scotland, where so many of the key events in the text take place. Now, Scottish historians at the time, I'm sure, must have been delighted to have this enormous new source that tells them so much about the very earliest parts of their national history. But it was also problematic because for centuries, the Scots had been banging on about the fact that they were one of the only places that had managed to resist Roman conquest. And suddenly this text turns up, which describes in great detail how the north of Britain had in fact not been able to repel the Romans and had been conquered. The way they deal with this is quite interesting. So Hector Boyce famously writes his Historia Gentis Scotorum, History of the Scottish People, published in Paris in 1527. He includes a lot of Agricola, a lot of it word for word. He includes the famous speeches word for word. And he includes the defeat at Mons Graupius of the Caledonian Confederacy. But then, really interestingly, he creates his own sequel, completely fictional sequel, in which Calgacus, who he says is the king of Scots, in fact, makes a spectacular comeback. And they win lots of battles and they push the Romans back out of Scotland again. All of it complete fantasy. And then a few years later, the chap you can see on the slide here, George Buchanan, just after his death, in fact, his work, History of Scottish Events, is published, Rerum Scoticarum Historia, and he does pretty much the same thing. He cuts out a lot of the excess that Boyce includes, but this idea that it was a temporary defeat becomes set in stone, and in fact, Buchanan's History of Scotland becomes the real classic reference for Scottish history right up until the 18th century. Now, when I make my journeys along the wall or along this road, I'm very aware that I'm following in the footsteps of some really interesting people. 300 years ago, there was a huge blossoming in interest in ancient Rome and ancient Scotland. Antiquarianism becomes a popular pastime amongst the wealthy elite, who've all been brought up, of course, with their classical education. So men like Sir Robert Sibbald, that you can see here, and Sir John Clarke of Pennycook, they get on horseback in their case and they head off across the Scottish landscape with a copy of the Agricola, looking for the things that they can read about. Sibbald published many tracts during his lifetime. We know that he travelled along the Roman road that I did because he mentions it in the late 1600s. There's another chap called William Maitland in the 1740s who travels along the Roman road, and they sometimes do plans and maps, which are really useful for us because there are lots of places where the road has disappeared. Other things have disappeared thanks to agriculture and urbanization. But we have these old maps, we have the old descriptions. Sibbald travels along the Gask Ridge on the Roman road, and he tells us that it was known to the local people then as the Street Way, which is quite interesting. William Maitland travels into Dunblane along a bit of Roman road that doesn't seem to be there anymore. And that was known in the area as the Old Road. So even in the 18th century, amongst the general population, there was a knowledge that this was a road with a really ancient history. It wasn't only Scots who were interested in this stuff. So people come from far and wide. Wales, in the case of Thomas Pennant, that you can see here. Also a French chap called Louis de Rochette, who's working for a French duke, who's making a new edition of Tacitus. They come up to Scotland, 1760s, 1780s. They travel along the road. They do that thing of trying to match the Tacitus with what they can see on the ground along them. Pennant's interesting because he notices clear similarities between the Romans marching into the north, building roads, building forts in order to suppress the population, and what the Hanoverians had just been doing in the aftermath of the Jacobite rebellions. They do exactly the same thing. They build roads, they build forts, just creating a military network throughout the north to suppress any possible further uprisings. Pennant, I should say, was a great admirer of both the Roman army and the Hanoverian army and the projects that they did. He describes both of these projects, saying that civilization was the consequence of the labors of both. So that in his mind, this is all about bringing civilization to what is still, as he sees it, a very barbaric land. But you do also see people starting to suggest that this fascination with Agricola is going too far. That French man, Louis de Rochette, notes in his manuscripts that you can see in the National Library of Scotland, he says there is an idolatry, which means that the majority of military sites in the isolated regions are attributed to Agricola. So he's noticing that whenever people find anything that looks even vaguely like a Roman fort or fortler, they immediately say it must have been built by Agricola. And by 1796, a Scottish historian has labelled this bad habit as Agricola mania. He calls it Agricola mania, which has so deeply infected many of our Scottish antiquaries. So this huge love of the text, of the history, of the story, really causes people to make all these very unconvincing conjectures. So during the 1800s, the interest in Roman Scotland fades rather. People get more into all the romantic figures like Bonnie Prince Charlie and Robert the Bruce, American of Scots. But by the late 1800s, there's a renewed interest. Around the turn of the 20th century, we see the rise of modern archaeology. And again, this rise in interest in Rome's exploits in northern Britain, probably not coincidentally at the same time that the British Empire was reaching its zenith or its nadir, depending on how you want to think of it. People are very focused on the idea of how you build and control empire. This photograph shows the excavations at Ardagh Fort, one of the ones that I saw, and I'll show you some images of today. And this, it's now that people start to be able to definitively date these sites. Some of them, it turns out, were built by Agricola. Some of the ones that they thought were probably belonging to the later Roman incursions. And then when we jump to the second half of the 20th century is when we get to aerial archaeology. And this has a huge impact on our understanding of the history of this, this period. Lots of Roman camps suddenly start to appear as crop marks. The archaeologists among you will know that in dry summers, the underground structures kind of are reflected in the growth above them. So if you get up in a plane and fly above and take photographs like this one, you can see the ghost almost of what's lying under the ground. So the outlines of Roman camps, some of them next to big hills, of course, interestingly enough. Roman forts start to appear as well, and bits of the Roman road that had been lost start to appear. So in this photograph that you're looking at now, this is a place called Elgin Haw, which is just to the southeast of Edinburgh. And I think you can very clearly see the road here, arch mark of the road running into that. I think that is the outline of the fort, and apparently running out the other side, although after that it disappears, and that's where we get to that gap that runs, it doesn't run rather, along the south of Edinburgh and along to the Antonine Wall. So quite what happens to the road there, we're not sure. Kenneth St. Joseph, of course, is the great name in aerial archaeology, an RAF veteran and archaeologist who got up in his plane and flew around and finding lots of fascinating things that relate to the Agricolan invasion. Elgin Haw was excavated much later. The area, as you can see from the photo, the area hadn't been developed at all. So it was almost completely excavated. And it was, at the time, and I think it probably still is today, the most fully excavated timber auxiliary fort in the world. And thanks to the archaeology, we can say pretty much without question that this dates to the period that we're focusing on this evening. Thanks to coins that were found at the site. There was a coin deposit under one of the buildings that was probably made in 79 AD, which is exactly the moment that the Romans should be arriving in this part of the world. And then a lack of coins after 86, which is exactly the moment we would expect them to leave. So this is the kind of evidence that we can use to be exactly sure that what we're looking at is what we should be looking at. So that is the history. Now it's time to get into a bit of my journey. So some of the edited highlights to give you a sense of the kind of things I was finding as I traveled along the road. And this is the spot where I started. This is my photograph from the top of a huge hill just north of the border that's called Woden Law. And this seemed to me like the perfect place to start the journey because the Roman road runs right next to Woden Law and past it. And in fact, in this photograph, this here is the Roman road, and then it heads way off in that direction, up and out of my photograph. So the Roman road curves around the hill and then off into the distance. Where I was standing on the top of this hill are the very clear embankments of an Iron Age hill fort. Here, in this field here, are two very well preserved Roman camps. And there's possibly another couple of very badly preserved ones over this side called Pennymuir camps. And very intriguingly, around the hill fort at the top of the hill are some extra embankments which have been interpreted as Roman siege works. Now, I should say not everybody agrees with this. This dates back to, I think it was the 50s they were excavated, and there was this conclusion that it was either a Roman siege or a practice for a Roman siege, but not everybody agrees with that. But it certainly makes for a compelling image to open a book about a Roman invasion, a hill fort with Roman camps, a Roman road, and possible siege works around about it. The evidence from the excavations did seem to suggest that this hill fort was abandoned just about the time that the Romans arrived, which I'm sure is not coincidental. And the view here does give you an idea of the opening miles of the journey. Where I was headed is here. You can just see in the distance the three peaks of the Eildon Hills, which are right next to Melrose and a very famous Roman site. The road you can see heads this way, but it kind of meanders a bit around here and then dog's legs straight back to the Eildon Hills over there. And that took me 2 days. And the road, well, let's focus on the road since it is the RRRA. Even in just this bit, the road appears in lots of different forms. So this is just north of the camps at Pennymuir. And to me, it's not so clear in the photograph, but you can kind of see a long ridge here with the road on top of it disappearing over the horizon. And the construction of the road, as is often the case, it varies depending on the conditions. Generally, we're looking at fairly typical construction, big stone base, solid rough blocks of stone, a layer of smaller stones above, and then metaling of gravel, and then maybe some clay and some sand in there to give a really solid surface, slightly cambered to allow the rain to pour off, and building it on the really solid stone base gives it this ridge that we call the Agar. And hopefully you can see it there. It's certainly very visible when you're walking along it. There is that raised ridge on this Roman road here that just lifts it above the rest of the landscape slightly. What they didn't find, as far as I know, in any part of this road are drainage ditches at the side, which are often seen on Roman roads, but not here, in fact. Now, I said a second ago, the road in this first bit is not particularly straight. And I know that's a cliche, but there are bits of this road that are incredibly straight. For the first few miles, I was weaving backwards and forwards. And I was also noticeably passing burial mounds, pre-Roman burial mounds, a stone circle, several hill forts on neighboring hills. And all of this put together has led some people to suggest that at least at this part, the road is possibly following a much older trackway that existed before the Romans arrived, and they just kind of reused it for their route to get through the hills. But as soon as it's beyond the hilliest bit, this is the Cheviot, it does, as I say, take a turn towards the northwest, and from that it's very very straight indeed. So a lot of what I was walking along looked like this. There's lots of farm tracks that still follow the Roman road. Many places it's quite muddy and soggy, particularly when I was doing it. But in this one, you can see a fairly solid surface of big lumps of stone. I'd love to think that some of these might, in fact, have been placed there by Roman hands almost 2,000 years ago. I would never be able to prove that, but I think it's not unlikely, let's say. And as is often the case, well, not just in Britain and everywhere, I believe, a lot of the road is still road. So it's country lanes. You can see this is very straight. This was just a very quiet country lane that led off to a couple of farms, but tarmacked and cars were going up and down it too. So this, this bit of road we can assume has always been open to traffic. And in some places, it has morphed into really busy highways. So now we're up close at those three hills called the Yieldons. This is part of the A68 as it leads into the village of St. Boswell. This is either on top of or right next to the Roman road. I'm sure most people that drive along this have no idea that they're driving along a road that's 1,900 plus years old. But interestingly, if you look on maps, even if you look on Google Map, it is marked, just this little bit of it outside St. Boswell is marked as the street. And presumably that name derives from Deer Street itself, that name that's been used for many centuries to describe the road. We don't, of course, know what it was called, if anything, in Roman times. So as we get further north beyond the Antonine Wall into Perthshire, we see what's probably the most impressive engineering feat on the road, the Inner Peffrey cutting. So I suspect some of you will know Inner Peffrey because of its beautiful library, which I popped into and had a look at some of their antiquarian books on the way. Right outside it is, well, at first glance, you might just think it's a dried riverbed or something like that. But this is a man-made road cutting. You can see it here. And this was the Roman road, we assume, running up it. So just at the bottom of this, it's quite a steep hill here. And at the bottom of it is the River Erne. And the Roman road, we assume, would have crossed it at a ford. And then we have this cutting, which just makes the climb up that hill easier, particularly, I suppose, if you had ox carts or something like that. It would be almost impossible to climb straight up the hill. So a cutting has been dug. It's 130 meters long. Now, 20 odd years ago, a group of archaeologists called the Roman Gas Project, because this is leading up onto the gas grid, the Roman Gas Project decided they wanted to investigate this and just try and determine once and for all that it was Roman, it was a Roman feature. Their excavation revealed that it was originally up to 15 meters wide at the top, so it's pretty enormous, 4.5 meters deep in places. Hollowing it out, they calculated, would have required the removal of 2,000 tons of sand. The sides of the cutting were then lined with clay to stop erosion, and there is no clay in this part of the world, so it must have been transported fairly long distances. So creating this cutting is an enormous project. But perhaps not surprisingly, the road as it runs up this cutting is much narrower than it is elsewhere, because obviously they decided just to make it single lane here, because to do a double track road would have almost doubled the amount, if not more than double the amount of work. So I guess you would have to wait at the top of the bottom for traffic to pass before you could carry on down it. And this is the road surface that they discovered. Now, the archaeologists amongst you will know that dating roads is very difficult. You hardly ever find datable objects when you dig up a road. In this case, they did find some medieval pottery. And you can also see the wheel ruts there. So it's obviously very well used here, and here you have these wheel ruts. The fact that there's medieval pottery, to me, and I think lots of other people, does suggest it almost certainly is Roman, because I don't think there's anyone pre-18th century, apart from the Romans, that would consider taking on such an enormous project. So although nothing definitively Roman was found, I think we can be 99.9% sure that this cutting is a bit of Roman engineering. Now, the road itself is just one part of this project to conquer and consolidate Roman power in the north. Alongside it, there are lots and lots of Roman military installations, lots of camps. So I mentioned Pennymuir Camp. There was where I took the photo from at the top of Wodenlaw. Here are the Pennymuir Roman camps. There's a big one and a little one that was built into the corner of it. Marching camps, or temporary camps, they're often called. So the soldiers of an evening would hastily dig a ditch and then build a rampart, maybe put up a wooden palisade, pitch their tents inside and stay the night, possibly. There's more and more evidence that some of these camps were used for longer periods, in fact. Pennymuir is often described as one of the best preserved in Scotland. Doesn't photograph very well, you'll have to take my word for it. This is a ditch, which is still very wet. You can see there's rushes growing out of it. And you see this is the rampart. It's really high, so it's probably from the ditch up, it's probably almost a couple of meters high, I would say, onto this kind of platform, and all the tents would have been in here. And it also offers a perfect view up onto that hill fort in Woden Law, which I'm sure is, is done on purpose. So camps, they're moving around. Also, the camps would have provided accommodation for the men who are building the road and all the other stuff. They need to stay somewhere. So some of these camps may relate to the road builders themselves. I saw, unsurprisingly, lots of forts. The first major fort you come to is the celebrated Trimontium, just outside Melrose. So I'm now at the other side of those three hills. That's two of them in the background there. And you can see the fairly clear crop marks of the Roman fort of Trimontium streets. This is the outer wall here. We're pretty sure it's called Trimontium. There's a place called Trimontium mentioned in the Ptolemy's Geography, a 2nd century cartographical work. It means the place of the three hills, and it's right next to three hills. So although they've never found anything referring to that name at the site, I think that's pretty much taken as read. Discovered relatively recently. So we only found out about this fort in 1904, and it was excavated in the following years. And they found amazing things, amazing artifacts. I'll show you one later on. A large fort, in fact, several forts built one on top of another. Annexes around about it that probably contain civil settlements. This dip here was later identified as a wooden amphitheatre, probably used for military training and military shows. To date, that is the northest securely identified amphitheatre in the world. Behind that, you can see a Victorian railway viaduct. There would have been a Roman bridge there taking our road over the River Tay, and that's almost certainly why the fort is put there. When you walk along the road, you see forts and other installations next to river crossings, guarding and watching the movement over the bridge. And also in the background there, that's another hill fort. There's a hill fort on top of one of the Eildon Hills, so possibly built to survey the local inhabitants too. So as you get further north, so that the Antonine Wall is here, Edinburgh's here, Perth is here. This is where you get to this area where there's lots of militarized sites, and also some great sections of the road. Further south, it's mostly just crop marks and fields where you can see on your map there was something here. But as we get into Perthshire, there were lots of amazing remains to see. The most famous of all, and my favourite, and so somebody else was praising it in the comments earlier, is the incredible fort at Ardagh, sometimes described as one of the best preserved Roman forts that we have. It has these amazing ditches. This is the east side. Also, the north side has multiple ditches. Robert Sibbald came here. This place has been drawing tourists and antiquarians for centuries, and they've all been incredibly impressed by what they saw. Robert Sibbald thought this was where Mons Graupius may have taken place. Excavated in the 1890s, what they in fact found were three forts, a wooden one built during the Agricola period, then abandoned, and then when they built the Antonine Wall, they re-inhabit this, recommission this as a northern outpost in the 140s. A bit further up from here is a fortlet. Now, again, I passed the site of many fortlets. Most of them have been erased from the landscape by agriculture and appear in those crop marks, or if you dig down. This one is the best preserved on the route that I took. It's known today as Kames Castle. So basically a fortlet is like a mini fort. It's got a rampart and a ditch, which you can kind of see. I think that's the ditch there. And you can see the platform. And there would have been a wooden palisade, maybe a tower over the gate, and some buildings inside. This is actually on private land. It's in somebody's garden. He's very happy for visitors to come take a look as long as you ask permission. He actually gave me a little tour, and he showed me right in front of the fortlet a low ridge running through his garden, running through his flower beds, which is almost certainly the Roman road. It's almost exactly parallel to the modern 8822. So not reused in this case, right next to the modern road. They dug here in 1900. They didn't find any remains of buildings inside the fortlet, but there must have been. That's probably down to the fact that back in those days they weren't quite so hot on finding more subtle remains of wooden buildings. And then you are over the river, up that cutting and onto the ridge, the Gask Ridge. And it's amazing. So I cycled along this. The road is incredibly well preserved as modern road, as paths and as tracks. There's only a couple of bits where you can't access it, but it's pretty much several miles that you can go along. And on either side of it, there are visible remains like this one that you can see here of towers, sometimes called watchtowers because we assume they were used to survey the surrounding landscape. Also sometimes referred to as signaling towers because almost certainly looking at the positions of them, we think they were used for sending messages over long distances with braziers or burning torches. So what remains today are circular ditches. This is what we think they look like. This is one of the recreations. Most of them are either ploughed out in fields or very overgrown forests. So you can still see some of them overgrown. But Kirkhill that I just showed you and two of the others are under the care of Historic Environment Scotland and have all been cleared and have panels. And it's absolutely fascinating. And this network of roads and forts and fortlets along the Gask Ridge is sometimes referred to as the Gask Ridge frontier system. And there's a very persuasive argument, I think, that this is Rome's first ever fortified land frontier that acted really as a prototype for what would later be constructed along between the Rhine and the Danube, and kind of a forerunner of the fortified ramparts that were built by Hadrian and Antoninus Pius in later generations. So a bit north of Perth, and strangely, a bit north of the road, is the most important site of all, not the best preserved, but the most important to the Romans, Inchtuthil. So there's a big plateau. The road's about 3 miles to the south, not sure why. And you can see here ditch here, and this is really the outline of an enormous legionary fortress that I assume was built as the kind of nerve center, as the final push into the north. Started around AD 82, abandoned 86 or 87. Unlike all, I think I'm right in saying all the other first century fortlets in Britain, nothing was built on top of it. So most of the other ones ended up as towns and cities, like York, for example. So this could be excavated very extensively in the 1950s. And they found lots of evidence of timber buildings, a stone wall. It's probably the first military site to have a stone wall in Roman Britain. But they also noticed lots of gaps. So this is the headquarters, which is normally a huge building. Here it's quite tiny and lots of gaps around about it. So what they think is it was still a work in progress when it was abandoned. They were getting ready to build a bigger, maybe a stone headquarters, fill in the gaps. And for whatever reason, the call arrives that they are in fact to abandon the whole thing. And not only do they abandon it, they demolish it as much as they can. And what the most amazing discovery they made at Inchtuthil was a huge hoard buried under the floor of a workshop of iron nails. And the outer nails had rusted into a crust and created anaerobic conditions inside the crust. So there were hundreds of thousands of perfectly preserved Roman nails inside, probably forged at Inchtuthil. The number of them implies that they were intended for several big building projects that were going to happen, but never did, as they planned to install their new infrastructure in this newest part of the Roman Empire. But they abandoned the fortress and they buried them all, because we think to hide them from the local people who would have loved all that iron to make weapons to fight the Romans, I guess. So along the route of the road, and just off the route of the road, there are some great museums too, where you can see a lot of the artifacts that relate to this great Roman invasion. Trimontium. So we saw the site of the fort. It's just outside the modern town of Melrose. And in Melrose itself is this fabulous museum run by the Trimontium Trust. It's just been given a massive facelift. They've spent millions on this incredible new state-of-the-art display. They've also just installed a VR, virtual reality experience, where I believe you can walk around the streets of Roman Trimontium I'm going up in September. I'm very excited about trying that out. The biggest and best collection of Agricolan artifacts in Scotland are not surprisingly found at the National Museum of Scotland at Chamber Street in Edinburgh. They have all sorts of things, carved altars, sculptures, tombstones, coins, lots of wonderful tableware, fancy stuff that was used by the important soldiers, the more mundane stuff that the auxiliaries would have carried around with them. And my favourite thing, this incredible cavalry mask found in a pit abandoned at Trimontium, probably represents the face of an Amazon and would have been used in the fancy choreographed military mock battles that they had, possibly in that amphitheatre, the wooden amphitheatre at Trimontium. And of course, this is the very haunting image that appears on the cover of the book. One of the things that I enjoyed the most was finding traces of Rome in really unexpected locations. I like to think of this as evidence of the kind of indelible mark that's been left on the Scottish landscape by the Romans. And also there are really tantalizing clues of the stuff that's still out there that we haven't found yet. So a really good example of this is in Jedburgh. I saw this rather faded, but still fairly impressive Roman inscription. Now, this is just part of what would have been a much larger altar. The name of the god has been lost, but it's dedicated by a chap called Gaius Quintius Severus in the first cohort of Vardulians. Now, this was found not dug up at a Roman fort or a fortlet. This was found in the floor of the presbytery of a medieval Jedburgh Abbey that was mostly built in the 13th century. And there's another, I think it's just part of a Roman altar built into the fabric of the church itself. I couldn't see it because I think it's reopened, but when I was there, it was closed for restoration. So this is what we call spolia, I suppose is the technical term. The builders who are creating the medieval abbey have found those stones somewhere, grabbed them just as a bit of Freemasonry, a nice ready cut block of ashlar. Where they come from, we have no idea. The nearest possible site, there's a fortlet on a river called the Oxenham Water, which is about 4 miles by road from Jedburgh. But to me, that seems quite a long way, considering when they were building the abbey again, it's just oxes and carts. So I think it's a clue that there might be something else closer to Jedburgh that was ransacked by monks and their stonemasons 700 years ago, and that has now become hidden again. So waiting to be discovered. But I would say an absolute highlight of my trip is this. So it doesn't look very exciting in this photograph. This is a place called Crichton, which is, I guess, just southeast of Edinburgh. It's famous for its castle. There's a little hamlet. And just outside the hamlet, in a very nondescript looking field, is a fenced off area of grass with big stones and this hole in the ground, which is clearly a door. And if you are brave enough, or stupid enough, you could say, to head inside, it's tiny, so not for claustrophobics. If you head down in there, you will find this. So it's I could almost stand up in this, and I'm 6'2", so I did have to bend down a little bit, but it's an underground stone passage, and it's a really good example of those structures that we find particularly in the northeast of Scotland, but elsewhere too, often called souterrains or earth houses. Iron Age in construction. What they're for has been much debated. When I was young, we were told that that's where Iron Age folk would go and hide when the Romans and other people turned up to attack them. Nowadays, there's another theory that there were cold storage. They were often found under the remains of Iron Age roundhouses. Quite difficult to date exactly. Some were clearly built before the Romans arrived, but some, including this one, were definitely built after the Romans arrived. And we can be 100% sure of that because many of the stones in the wall of this are cut by Roman stonemasons. They are squared or rectangular, what we call ashlar blocks, with this kind of herringbone or hatched effect that is typical of Roman buildings. So somewhere near there must be a Roman stone building. I mean, the obvious choice to me would be most of the Agricolan forts are wood, but they did build stone bathhouses. Pretty much all I think the Agricolan forts had stone bathhouses. So but if you look on the map, you won't see anything Roman near Crichton at all. So I think there must be something out there. This is fairly close to the road too. It's not exactly on the road, but it's fairly close to it. So somewhere out there will be the Ramon. Hopefully some of it, hopefully the builders didn't take all of it 1700 years ago when they built their earth house. Also, even more interestingly, I won't tell you too much about this. You'll have to read about this in the book. There's a carving on the ceiling there, which some people think is Roman. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I don't have time to. We're almost out of time, so I won't go into that today. So just to get back to the actual road itself, as I said, it's great in the borders. It kind of gets patchy and then disappears. It's great along the Gask Ridge, then it gets very patchy again as we head up further northeast. And then you get to Kirriemuir, and in the woodland just to the north of Kirriemuir is this farm track. It's called Cadham Wood. And there's a very long, straight stretch of track running through it. And although the jury's still out on this, many people think this is a bit of Roman road. That would be the final visible stretch of the road that I travelled along. And if it is, this would make it the most northerly bit of Roman road anywhere in the world. It's quite difficult to find. It's not marked on OS maps. It was Andrew Tibbs that told me about it, I think. I found some grid references to it on a website online and typed those in and found an aerial view of the wood, and you can see a gap running through the trees very straight. I think it's over a kilometre. I got to the wood, I couldn't find it. I asked local people, and they didn't know that there was a Roman road in the forest, interestingly, but they sent me in the wrong direction. So I think they'd got confused about what the supposed Roman road was. But I did eventually find it. The first bit I found, you can clearly see what looks like a cambered road and ditches either side in this case. It's very overgrown, and then it flattens out into this track. And then it just disappears at the other end of the forest. It doesn't relate to modern or 18th century roads in any way, but if you follow it straight on, you come to about 2 miles to the northeast, you come to a Roman fortlet. And if you head back the other way in a direct line, you come to a Roman fort just outside Meagle. So to me, that's pretty convincing. So I think we could say this is the last visible bit of that road. And for me, this was the end of the road. And then the final bit of the journey, of course, was looking for Mons Graupius. As I said earlier, I do not have the answer. Sorry if that disappoints you. I went to see several possibilities. Inchtuttle's another one that some of the antiquarians thought was as well as Ardagh, but there's quite a few other options. Some of them obviously weren't it, almost definitely, but were interesting nonetheless. I do pick one that's my favourite. I'm not going to tell you what it is. No spoilers here. One that does fit the description in Tacitus, but also just being a bit kind of Agricola maniac about it, does fit your image of where an amazing dramatic battle would take place. If you were filming a movie and putting Mons Graupius in it, there is one place that you think this would be the perfect location for it. So a mixture of real historical evidence, archaeological evidence, and just my flights of fancy as well do lead to one definite conclusion. So I guess we're pretty much out of time. We've been talking for an hour, give or take my faffing around at the beginning. There's so much more to say about the journey, about my road. There's not just Roman things along it, of course. There are castles, sites of major medieval battles, including the most famous of all, Bannockburn, is on the Roman road. There are important old churches, even the remains of one of Scotland's most important medieval hospitals. And it's no coincidence that all these later structures are also next to the road, because for centuries, it was an incredibly important route into Scotland and then through central Scotland into the Highlands. In fact, Murray Cook, who's the archaeologist at Stirling Council, he spoke to me when I was on my journey, told me about the work he's doing in trying to locate the road that runs through the town of Stirling and over the Forth. He described it as the most important road in Scottish history. So it's important in Roman history, but there's so many other elements to it as well. And it's really played a key role in so many of the major events in Scotland's past. And I must admit, having travelled along it, I'm very much inclined to agree with that description of it as the most important road in Scottish history. So there we are. That is the end of the road, the end of my talk. And hopefully there are now some questions. We can do some Q&A.
Yeah, I hope so.
Shall I stop sharing now, Mike, or should we leave the slide up, or what? How do you prefer to do it?
It's entirely up to you. Leave it up
Let's
and
leave it
give
up.
people a chance to write down the details of.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, a good
I'm
bit
sure,
of
you're going to get lots of sales. I'll be very disappointed with our audience if you don't.
Yes, I should say is that if you go to the publishers, they've got it on a discounted price as well. That's my bare-faced salesmanship there.
Yeah, I thought it wasn't out until the 1st of March, so you've sort of taken me by surprise here.
Yes, it's out. It's literally hot off the press.
And we do have questions. Right. So, how are you faring? I know you
Yes,
said
I'm fine. Fine. Yes,
you're
yes.
okay. Okay. All right. First from Tonya. No surname, I'm afraid. How do you think Inchtooth Hill Fortress relates to the road or the battle? Mons Graupius, presumably.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There were lots of 18th century theories that Mons Graupius happened near Inchtooth Hill, but they're very unconvincing. There were also lots of 18th century theories that Inchtooth Hill was a Pictish city. So there's lots of fanciful stories about it. There's a great story, Hector Boyce that I mentioned, who makes up all the stuff about the Romans being pushed back out of Scotland after Mons Graupius. He tells that just before Mons Graupius, there were all these mystical happenings at Inchtooth Hill, including the birth of a hermaphrodite and weird happenings in the stars. So there's lots of fascinating myths about it, but I think I'm sure the Mons Graupius thing is pretty much a myth. The thing about the road is a real mystery. As I said, I think the road runs directly 3 miles to the south of it, which does seem incredibly weird. Because obviously this is built as the nerve center of the northern invasion. I always like to think if they hadn't retreated, the capital city of Scotland might be where Inchtoothill is now. Because York becomes this incredibly important place, and that's the kind of the similar thing going on south. I mean, the one thing is we're assuming the road was built during the conquest. Some people think it wasn't. Plans change as things happen, so they might have built the road and suddenly realized that the plateau where Inchtoothill was the perfect place to put a fortress. It's great for surveying the land about. It's also great for being seen for long distances, and there was a whole psychological thing. They place their forts in places that are good for guarding landscape and watching over the movement of people, but also they want people to see them and know that they're in charge. So I suspect there will be a what you call a little a little road that heads off the main road towards it. There certainly is. From Inchtoothill to the big hill next to it, where they quarried the stone, they found a fairly well-built bit of Roman road there, and that's only been uncovered relatively recently. So I suspect there would have been a little kind of slip road, I suppose you might call it, linking up Inchtoothill to the road that I was traveling along. But it does. There are questions there, let's say.
Still talking about the road. Frank Reynolds. This isn't a question, but he says he's got compelling evidence for part of the road through West Lothian.
Well, that's interesting.
Which he would be happy to share with you.
I would love to hear that, because that is the gap, I suppose, isn't it? And as I said, if you look at quite a few modern maps of Roman roads in Scotland, quite a few of them don't include that bit from Elginhall, Dalkeithish to the Antonine Wall.
Yeah, it is a bit of
I don't know how much research has been done into it, to be honest. I assumed it was purely conjectural, that line, but it would be really interesting if people...
Yeah, I'm not sure what the LiDAR coverage is around there, but it's certainly on my target to have a look in that area. See if
But the issue is it's also one of the most urbanized bits of Scotland as well. So in the same way that the Antonine Walls had a really hard time compared to Hadrian's Wall, that if that will be the bit where it's been obliterated anywhere.
Frank, I don't know if you have any contact details for Alan, but if you don't, by all means contact me, because I'm keen to know as well.
Yeah,
and pass it on to Alan. So mike@romanroads.org, and that will get to Alan through me. Moving on, Mark Willingdale. Evening, Mark. On the tower sites, have they found signs of timber pile foundations, as were noted by Michael Lewis on the German Limes, that could have
So
been supports of the survey platforms?
what they tend to find when they dig into those platforms, and they have been doing that for 100 years now, they will find, well, there's the ditch with a little walkway across it, an earth walkway. There's normally signs of a turf or earth rampart just inside that presumably had a wooden palisade. And then inside that, generally what they find are 4 big post holes. So the corner posts of the towers themselves. And in some of the modern excavations, I believe they've also found little fragments of wattle and daub, which would presumably be the walls of the towers.
I'm pretty sure that the couple that were excavated on the Stainmore, which are of the same period and the same design, were exactly the same post holes. I have actually been trying to check David Williscroft's book to see if there's anything in it, but it doesn't give a lot of detail, unfortunately, on military signalling. But if anybody is interested in military signalling, I would recommend you read it.
There's a paper about signalling on. Oh yeah, there's a paper about signalling on the gas grid, which is really fast.
Yes, they're available online, I think, aren't they? If you if you just Google it, you should be able to find that. Anybody who can't find it, contact me and I'll root out the references. Yes, right, next. Toby. Surely on the Agricola advance, they transported goods and troops from the Roman port near Leith to Inchtooth Hill and must have been accessible on the banks of the Tay at high tide. Lugging tons of nails by barely built roads seems unlikely.
So, well, it would be both, I assume. Certainly, as we said, a lot of the forts are built on rivers. There's big questions about how navigable those rivers were 1800 years ago. Certainly, not many of them are now. You could probably get smallish barges up some of them, I think. But there is the idea that they're built next to the river, as I said, partly to monitor access over the bridges on the road, but also possibly for boats traveling up and down. You've got a kind of ready-made road, if you like, in the form of a river. I don't know about a port near Leith. I don't know about that one. I mean, the port is quite Rome. There's lots of writing about Roman ports in Scotland, and when you actually dig into the ports, it's quite difficult to.
Something is nagging in the back of my mind that says there is something near Leith, but it's from Septimius Severus's campaign.
Right.
Maybe wrong. Don't quote me on that. There's just a little thing just nagging in my head. I'd have to check, and unfortunately, we don't have time because there's lots and lots of questions coming in.
Right. Well, the one thing I will say is that not all the forts are on rivers, so some of the stuff must have been travelled overland too. Not everything would be accessible by boat, but boat would certainly be a very useful part of the whole project.
From John Coshall, a really interesting presentation, and he's already reading your book and he's enjoying it. Is there any evidence that Inchtooth Hill Legionary Fortress acted as a supply base for Mons Graupius?
So it's difficult. The dating of it's impossible to be completely accurate, but it does seem to have been built just before Mons Graupius probably happened. So I think it's more likely it would be largely a building site as Mons Graupius was happening. I don't think it would be completely finished. Well, it was never completely finished, as we saw, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much that would have been up and running by Mons Graupius. So I would suggest probably not, but this is all very conjectural, I would suggest.
Okay. Polwood, is there a possibility we are still to find more, such as the use of the Roman fleet in the far north and any suspected bases? I think David Breeze might have touched on this in the talk he gave a few months ago.
Did he? I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to track movements over water because apart from the ports, you don't. I must say I don't know much about ports in Roman Scotland. I know people like Robert Sibbald. He basically claimed every inlet and modern harbour in Scotland was built by Agricola, as they tended to do back then. Um, I think Andrew Tibbs has got images of something that he thinks might be where Carpoo is, but again, yeah, that's
Yeah,
Septimius Severus.
yeah.
So I must say I don't know too much about the whole ports thing, but I think it would be quite difficult to say. Stonehaven Bay, for example, would be a perfect harbour,
Mm.
great for landing stuff, and that's very likely the Mons Graupius area, and it's an exact line with the line of forts that goes up. But there's nothing Roman being found at Stonehaven. But that doesn't mean there's not something waiting to be found.
No, as you said, if anybody would know, it would be Andrew, but I don't think he's in the audience, so we can't ask him.
No, he's not. I know he's not
Oh,
tonight.
you've checked, right? Okay.
He told me he couldn't.
Um, John Lucas, um, what is the geology of the souterrains locations? Given the ashlar linings, they seem to be cut and cover, which would incline towards softer ground. And from the
Right.
comment about some being found under roundhouses, this could indicate that they were used for food storage of
Yeah.
grains, etc.
That is certainly the common. That's the modern theory. I say modern. I mean the last couple of decades, I think. And sometimes they're literally under the roundhouse, as if you could step down like a cellar, basically, in a modern house. So
I I went into one a very long time ago, and I can't even remember exactly where it was now. And the one thing I remember about it was how bloody wet it was.
I
Um,
don't know if you noticed in my photograph, there's little stalactites hanging off the ceiling of the one that was in a
yeah.
constant thing. I
So
was I was really worried it was going to be waterlogged. In fact, there was a big puddle, but it wasn't too bad.
always made me wonder, food
Yeah,
storage in
not
conditions like
great.
that doesn't
Yeah, it's
really
not
make
great for food
sense.
storage if it's damp, is it? That's an interesting point.
Yeah. Um, Short answer is we just don't know, do we,
I
really?
suspect we might never know with these. They're quite strange.
Dylan Matthews, is there still much evidence to be found of quarries, presumably located nearby to the sections of road?
Um,
You do normally get quarry pits
yes, I know you
close
get
to
that at the
roads,
Antonine
so it's
Wall Road, and I know you
yeah.
get that, and I wasn't aware of any, and I did. I mean, often they're not that obvious to the traveler, but I've read up a lot on it. I don't know. I mean, not huge amounts of the road have been excavated, I should say. There's trenches at various points. There's been bits on the Gask Ridge have been done a couple of times, and
Mm.
bit on Sutra was done too. And Sutra, it was quite interesting. They built it on a kind of turf base, I think, because it's really damp there,
Mhm.
and bits on wooden base as well. So I'm not sure. I don't know is the answer to that question, but there must be. There will be. Yeah.
Again, back in my head, without checking my files, I couldn't actually say, but I'm pretty sure there are at some points. I think there's some aerial photographs where you can see them fairly clearly, but
Right.
don't ask me where because I can't keep the details of about 500 roads in this country in
Oh,
me
I'm sure.
out of my head. But I'm pretty sure there are. Um,
I'm very disappointed you don't know every single Roman road. Right.
I try, but I'm not. I haven't got a brain that big, sadly. Um, from David Bray. Evening, David. Um, yes. Mm, Comment really. Roads were usually built later. Yes and no. You don't go fighting wars in hostile territory and building roads at the same time. Indeed, at what stage would Romans have had time or need to build an engineered road north of the Forth?
So yes, you're not the first person to say that. Obviously, the dating of the road has been questioned. Um, I think yes, I think it's more likely it would be built as the um as the conquest has kind of so maybe just post Mons Gropius, I suspect. Um, but it's well, we don't know. We don't know. I mean, some people think it might be even later, but I don't buy that because it clearly links up all the Agricolan sites in that part of the world, with
Yes.
the exception of Inch Tuthil. So some people have said maybe the road was built in the 2nd century during the Antonine period, but to me that doesn't make any sense at all. So I think we can be certain it's Agricola. At what point they built it during the invasion and conquest, we can't know. We'll never know.
No.
But
the evidence we have,
they're clearly building as they go. They're building forts as they go, because Elginhof is built in 79, and then they're building in Staffel 3 years later. So I don't see why you shouldn't also build bits of road if you're building forts and towers but
it's difficult to know with any certainty, but for me, it's not realistic for it to have been built any later than the Agricolan period. It just doesn't make sense if it was.
And in a way, that's
David's absolutely right on some things, and some roads we know for certain that the forts were built well before the roads, and in some cases, John Poulter's actually established that in one case on Deer Street, you've got a 30-year gap between the planning and the actual construction. It's as big as that.
That's interesting.
And we see similar things actually elsewhere where the road cannot possibly have been built for quite some possible time for some long time.
And that I should add very briefly, I go into this in the book. There's also big questions about how long this occupation lasted. You know, there were it's always the case. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historian, but when I dig into the archaeology, there's always these things where you find these outlying weird bits of evidence that suddenly suggest the towers on the Gasworks were rebuilt, which you would only do after, long periods of time. So there's so many questions there. Where do you start and where do you end? But yes, it is complicated and difficult to be sure, for sure.
Yeah. We'll never know until somebody develops a dating technology where we can date a road to within a year. We're just not going to know.
Date a nice lump of rock. Yeah, I don't know.
From Jill McIntyre, given the excavation evidence for early Roman penetration in at least northern England, and the possibility of penetration into Scotland by Agricola's predecessors, are we guilty of falling for Tacitus's PR in ascribing so much to his father-in-law?
Yeah, well, that's another possible explanation for the signs of rebuilding at some of the towers. Is not that they stayed longer; it's that they came earlier.
Yes,
and that's obviously very contested.
David Woolliscroft has suggested that, hasn't he? And it didn't go down well.
But the guy, I've forgotten his name, the guy that excavated Elginhof totally refuted that and said there's no reason to assume that.
Yeah.
But there are clues also. I think there's a poem that mentions one of the previous emperors building towers in the north of Britain or something like that. And there's also
yes, that was Belanus. So with an AD 69-ish. Yeah. But exactly where he built those towers and forts, I have my own theory about this, which some of the audience already know. I suspect forts that it's referring to are actually the so-called temporary camps across the Stainmore. That's my.
But the thing is, as I think I said about Tacitus, these guys are writing this stuff in Italy or wherever. They have no idea of what Britain is, or what the geography is, or where the Caledonians are, or it's all second and third and fourth hand. So I think you can't rely on it too much. But that also means you can't rely on the Tacitus too much either. But
no, but it is surprising how much of what little he wrote, because let's face it, there's not a lot, does actually fit with.
Well, the Elgin Hall thing is amazing. That the dates are on the coins are
bang on
exactly. But then there's always going to be questions, I suspect.
Plenty to come. You still okay to answer a few more?
Yeah, let's go for it.
From Philip Bevan. Great presentation, Alan. As to battle site, Ewan Lindsay, ScottishHistory.org, gives a meticulous and convincing argument. I don't know how you pronounce this. Is it Clevidge Hill? Just east of the Dunning Roman camp, and certainly dismisses Benecki, which is
Benecki.
Benecki.
I had to learn
my Yorkshire.
No, I had to learn how to pronounce that as well. I was pronouncing that wrong till I got there. I thought there was I mean, there's been a couple of theories recently that have, as I understand it, and again, I've been talking to archaeologists about that as a non-archaeologist, that had used camps as evidence that had turned out to be almost certainly not, or possibly not, Agricolan. So I don't know what the Dunning. I have read about Dunning Camp, but I've not been there. So this, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could go on. You could write a whole book just about the theories of Mons Graupius.
Yes, he could.
There'll always be new theory. As I said, my intention was never to add a new theory because it's. I see my well, no, in fact, I won't say that because that's going to conclusion of the book. I don't want to give too much away, but you know, it will. Well, the other big question is, did Mons Graupius happen, and what was it? Was it really this huge battle? Was it a skirmish? I mean, it's
Given the numbers that were involved, I would think it must have happened.
I think so. Well, I think it must have happened. Sorry, you go.
The audience that Tacitus was actually writing to,
Yeah.
many of those would have actually, those people would have either been there or their fathers would.
That's
So,
what I say in the book. You couldn't make it up.
You couldn't make it up, really.
I agree. But it might not have been the massive tens of thousands of men battle that is implied.
Oh, I'm sure it wasn't. His job was to really big Agricola up.
Yeah.
Exactly the opposite to Domitian. But anyway, let's not go into that one.
Yes.
From Girard, I walked Deer Street up to Pennymuir from High Rochester last summer. Lovely walk, some great features, and all largely unspoiled. Coming down from Wodenlaw to Tow Ford, it really felt like the Romans would have needed a bridge over the stream in order to keep the road open in the winter and early spring months. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I do because when I was there, I did that bit in April, and the river was flooded, and it's just a ford now, so flooded that even a car wouldn't have been able to get across it. But luckily, there's a little footbridge. So I thought that was I say in the book, it's the perfect example of why the campaigns actually only happen in the summer, because so much of the countryside is virtually impassable, even in April. So you can imagine what it's like at this time of year. Yeah, but I mean, travel was incredibly difficult back then, and so there would have been times where they were kind of virtually cut off in places, I suppose. I mean, you could have got through it, but you would have got wet legs, and I suppose a cart would have maybe got through it possibly, and maybe more used to taking risks than we are when it comes to traveling around.
Well, in the early stages of campaign, possibly, but they would have built a bridge as soon as possible. And
I don't know if they would build. They certainly would. I think on that particular one, that a decent ford would have done it.
It would, but there's you are right, but there's a big but here.
Yeah.
We do have evidence from quite a few sites, not just in this country, but elsewhere, that is suggesting, can't prove it, but suggests that bridge elements were prefabricated. So they already actually had the timbers ready to go. They just had to cut them to length.
That's interesting.
And they brought them with them when they needed to bridge. They could build a bridge in very little time. We're talking a matter of a few hours. That fast. Over something the size of a watercourse that size, it really would not have taken long.
Yeah.
So for me, bridges are the only thing makes sense. Fords make no sense at all.
That's interesting. I mean, you'll know more about that than I do, but now you say that, it makes sense that some of the River Erne at that inner periphery as well. They all talk about a ford, but it's pretty big and deep.
Yeah,
I'm not an expert in crossing rivers, but now you say it, I think that's
the idea of fords has got entrenched, I'm afraid, with Roman roads, and it's not helped with some of the accounts of Cassius Dio, for example, of the conquest, talking about swimming across the Thames. That doesn't help. Because, yes, of course, they had to do in certain occasions on campaign, but you wouldn't do that every time. You get a bridge up as soon as you possibly can. The important thing about an army on the move is not the army, it's the baggage train behind it. That has got to move, and you can't do that through fords.
No.
Not effectively, because the ford would become out of use in no time at all, unless it was properly built in stone, and that does take time. Building a timber bridge can be done in hours.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And until somebody can prove me wrong, I'm sticking to it. And I'll say it again, I've said this before on these talks at least 10 times. Anybody can prove an engineered Roman ford in northern Britain, I'll give them £10,000. I've said so for the last 15 years. My money is still safe.
You have convinced me. But it's fascinating that there were no, because I also on my anti-9 wall walk looked at this, that there's no, as far as I can find, there's no convincing evidence of a Roman bridge in Scotland. There's lots of places where people say there must have been a bridge,
Yeah,
where there's medieval bridges that people called the Roman Bridge, but are nothing of the sort.
yeah.
But there's not, and there's antiquarian stories about big stones being found in the river with metal attachment, but there's nothing that
No.
you can actually touch and see that is evidence of a Roman bridge in Scotland.
The time periods we're talking about are so short, they will have been entirely timber. There wouldn't have been any stone involved in them at all. So it's no surprise that there's nothing left.
Yeah,
Um,
that makes
we could
sense.
talk about this all night, but we've got a
Yes.
lot of other
Okay,
things to get.
let's not
I
get.
should actually qualify what I just said with rushing through it. When I was talking about I will give you £10,000, but that's over a substantial water course, not a piffling little stream that you can step over. Just to make that clear.
That's clear.
Okay. Jenny Wilson, would nails not be made here at the forts? That refers back to a previous question, I think.
In Stuthill,
I think that's what she's mentioning, yes.
yes, so they were found. The nails were found under the floor of a big building, which seems to have been a workshop, where there probably would have been woodworkers and ironworking and all that stuff. So they did have at the legionary fortress all that stuff being made to ship out to the sites around about for building forts, towers, whatever they, a town, if they ever got that far, all the stuff they might have been planning, but then suddenly never came to be.
And next one, we've still got a few to go. From Anthony Durham, the case for Mons Graupius being near Duncrube and Dunning in the
Oh yes,
Ochil Hills, made originally by Richard Feacham, looks very strong, notably the place called Victoria by Ptolemy and the cosmography.
yes, the Victoria, yeah.
Also, you didn't mention about the later Roman incursions north of the Forth, but that wasn't especially relevant. But
That yes, I do mention them a bit in the book, but not so much tonight. I must say I couldn't go see all the Montes Gropii or whatever you would call it, just because there's so many, and also I as I say, I picked the ones that I thought had an interesting story or there was something interesting to see, so I didn't go to all of them. And I think in a way, there's a couple that could be, but they're just not very inspiring. As I said, I kind of wanted somewhere that felt like somewhere where a great battle for the ages might have taken place. There's all. I just think the hill itself must have been remarkable because a couple of the potential Mons Graupiuses are more like hillocks really, and I think if this is something that has gone down in history that people are remembering and writing about and talking about across the Roman Empire, it can't just be a slight rise.
I would certainly tend to agree.
But that's all just it's all just guesswork, isn't it? Really.
Right. I'm not sure what. Susan, you've got a comment on here. I think this is yours. I doubt combat engineering is a modern concept. Not sure what that's with reference to. If it is yours, Susan, can you clarify it and send me a note? Susan, by the way, does all the hard work of getting the questions to me.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
I'd be lost without her. Harry Smith, remember Tacitus really had to finish with a grand winning battle. So was there a Mons Graupius? Well, you put that question yourself. If there was, it must be well north of the Tay, as they were well north of the river a year or two before the battle. This would go against the Dunning theory. I'm not so sure you can actually make that argument necessarily.
They do go north and then south again and then north again, and
yeah.
I mean, I think the text itself is so vague. I sometimes think we can get a bit caught up in trying to analyze it because there's almost nothing there that you can grasp onto really.
Mm,
And the idea that just by studying the text, suddenly there's going to be a light bulb moment that it
yeah.
will. I just don't think that's going to
No.
happen. That's just my impression anyway. Um, that we'll just have to wait, and it will. If it's there, it will appear rather than us finding it. If that makes sense.
Susan's just clarified that that comment was actually an aside meant for me. Sorry, Alan. From John Lucas. How far is the Gasque Ridge from the sea? It may have been quicker to keep a fast-moving army supplied by sea rather than a main supply base, which is farther and farther to the rear as the army advances.
So it's not that far to this. It's not that close to the sea, but it does end at Perth, where there's the River Tay, which is quite wide. So you could sail up the Tay certainly. Um, was that the question? Sorry, I've lost track of what the question
No, he was
was.
just simply, he obviously doesn't know the geography because he was asking
Yes.
how
Yeah.
far
So
it was from the sea. So
it ends very close to a wide river that leads out to a big estuary. So not that far, so I suppose you could sail things up. Well, you could sail things up, in fact, from the south of Britain and then up into the estuary and then land it and then take it along the roads to the forts that are further inland. Would be the obvious way.
I think, unless I've missed something, I think that's actually it. Is there anything else, Susan?
Right.
If there is, just send something through.
No, I mean, there's comments coming through, but bearing in mind that you're feeling a bit under the weather, I'm sort of I'm putting through the questions rather than just the comments because people seem to be having quite a good conversation in the chat as well. So it's
Good.
provoked a lot of comment, which has been
Other
good.
Mons Graupius theories popping up in the comments. It is I mean, it's fascinating. It is the eternal mystery. In a way, I sometimes think with these things, if they ever find it, it might be a bit disappointing. And the search is maybe more fun than the actual the finding in some occasions, I suspect.
I think that there is some investigations going on at one site, or planned for later this year, I think. But I cannot for the life of me remember where, and I wouldn't say so even if I knew. But yeah, I'm pretty sure there is.
I'll be annoyed if they find it somewhere else now and it's not in my book. I need to rewrite it for the next edition.
I'm even trying to remember who it was who mentioned it. It will either have been John Reed or David Breeze. So if you ask them.
I can ask John Reed. Yeah, I'm good. Yes, I'll be there soon enough. So.
Okay, I think that's it then.
Thank you very much. That's been great fun. It's the first lecture I've done about the book, and it's been really good fun.
Oh, I'm sure there'll be plenty more. And yeah, you had a very good audience. It peaked. I was trying to keep track of it. I think it was 306.
Right.
Which is pretty good.
No, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me.
No, you're more than welcome. And if you write another book that's anything to do with Rome, then I suspect you'll be back again with a bit luck if we've not put you on too much. Just stay there for a minute, Alan. Right, all that remains then is firstly to thank the backroom team, which tonight was Susan, who you've just seen, and of course Jeff, who you didn't see, but he's been hosting tonight. And to thank you all for attending. It's been a great audience. Specifically, I really do want to thank those who, many of you repeatedly make donations to help us fund all this. We couldn't do it without you. And tonight, the amount we've raised has been absolutely staggering. So thank you very much indeed. It will enable us to do a lot more in future. We're looking to actually do some proper webinars and in the coming year or so. So watch this space. Right. And with that, what I do need to do, and I've completely forgotten to get my screen up, so just bear with me. So it'll take a second. Oh, of course. Right. Our next talk is on the 27th of March. That'll be Neil Godfrey, who's talking about Romano-Celtic temples and Roman roads and the association between the two. I'm personally really looking forward to that. Largely because my other half is currently working on a Roman temple site in Gloucestershire, and it's a fascinating thing.
Mm.
Okay. I'll get the booking up for that in the next few days. And with that, I'm just going to wish you all a good night. Alan, we normally do a little bit of a conflab afterwards, so we log out and then come back in again if you're okay for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay,
Yes.
brilliant. Right, so again, thank you all and good night.